listeners, and welcome to the NK News podcast, recorded here in Seoul on Friday, February 8, 2019. Today I am joined by Ambassador Joseph DeTrani to talk about negotiating on nuclear weapons with North Korea in the past and the present. But before that, an announcement. Once again, NK News is offering a free year's subscription to one reviewer who reviews our podcast at iTunes or also at other platforms. And you can save $50 off your subscription by using the code podcast at the NK News checkout. And don't forget, if you enjoy this podcast, please share it with others so that our listenership will grow. Now, my next guest has a resume longer than my very long legs. Ambassador DeTrani was the U.S. Special Envoy for the six-party talks with North Korea and the U.S. representative to the Korea Energy Development Organization, or KEDO for short. Ambassador DeTrani was an Associate Director of National Intelligence and Mission Manager for North Korea and the Director of the National Counter-Proliferation Center, while also serving as a Special Advisor to the Director of National Intelligence. He served over 2 decades with the Central Intelligence Agency as a member of the Senior Executive Service and was an officer in the Air Force. He speaks fluent Mandarin Chinese and has published and spoken publicly on issues dealing with North Korea, China, cybersecurity, nuclear non-proliferation, and international organized crime. Currently, he is on the board of managers at Sandia National Laboratories and is a senior advisor at Oak Ridge National Laboratories. He is also a member of the board of trustees at Marymount University and an adjunct professor at Missouri State University's Graduate Department of Defense and Strategic Studies. And by my reckoning, we have about 30 seconds for the interview left. Thank you so much for joining me today, Ambassador DeTrani.
It's all over now, right?
It's all over.
There you go.
Thanks for coming. We'll get you the car back to the hotel. Now, what brings you to Seoul at this exciting time?
Well, there's a conference going on. It's every year the Washington Times organizes a fact-finding mission, and it's usually to Japan, to South Korea, and they're looking at possibly other countries, but so far it's been Japan and South Korea, to talk mainly about North Korea and some other issues that affect the bilateral relations with the United States. So in this instance here, it's a fact-finding mission. We usually meet with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and some other government agencies, the Blue House. And concurrent with that, they also have a conference going on. The Universal Peace Federation has a conference going on, and this is bringing over 100 representatives from different countries, over 100 countries, I might add, from these 100 representatives, to speak about peace globally, not only in the region, but global peace initiatives.
And it's quite a stellar cast of people, isn't it?
Yes, exactly.
A lot of
number
big names,
of former prime ministers, former heads of state. Yes, it's quite impressive.
During your fact-finding mission here, do you imagine that you will be meeting South Korea's Foreign Minister Kang Kyung-hwa?
Well, we've put in a request, and I know we are definitely going to meet the first vice foreign minister. But I don't know if the minister is in town, but that's to be determined today.
Well, if you could put in a good word for the podcast, because I've been trying to interview her for some time.
I will certainly mention our session today, yes.
No luck so far, but we'll keep trying. Now, could you go back and tell us how and when you first became involved in Korea-related affairs?
Well, it was 2003. I was at the Central Intelligence Agency at that time. My responsibility was director for East Asia. The State Department was looking for a special envoy. Ambassador Jack Pritchett had just resigned. And Ambassador Rich Armitage and Secretary Colin Powell reached out to me, and they said, you know the region. I've spent a number of years in China. China is very important to the North Korean issue that we have, and a bit of what's going on the Korean Peninsula. So would you be interested? And I took over as the special envoy in 2003, and I've kept that relationship going in 2006. Then I became, as you just said, the associate director at the DNI, responsible for North Korean issues. And with the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Center, which I was director of, and other jobs, I've always been very close to the North Korean issue. I left government in 2012. I continued meeting with the North Koreans at the vice foreign minister level, Lee Young-ho, Han Sung-ro, and others, with track 1.5 meetings.
Hang on, before we go, what's the difference, the sort of definition difference between track 1.5 and track 2?
Well, track 2 would be former government officials meeting with former North Korean government officials.
Okay.
Track 1.5 are former government U.S. officials meeting with North Korean officials.
Aha, okay. Got it. Okay. So it's unofficial on the U.S. end, but official on the North Korean end.
That's exactly right.
Got it. Now, I want to just go through some of the more important moments in the last 25 years of US DPRK relations and get your thoughts on them. In an April 2017 article for the website The Daily Beast titled "When We Almost Went to War with North Korea," Gordon Chang writes that you played a pivotal role in the negotiation of the agreed framework in 1994. But you just told me that you first became involved in Korea-related issues in 2003. Did you work on the agreed framework back in 1994?
No, I did not. I know Gordon, and I think he probably meant Bob Gallucci. Ambassador Gallucci worked on that.
Well, he definitely signed it for the US,
He signed it for the US, and he was very intimate with that. At that time, I was not doing East Asian affairs. I was responsible for European affairs.
Okay. Now, in the same article, he quotes you as saying that the deal succeeded in halting a frightening downward spiral and got North Korea to put more than 8,000 spent fuel rods in cooling ponds indefinitely. Did the agreed framework stop the North Koreans from producing plutonium, and if so, for how long?
I think the agreed framework was successful in that regard. It did stop North Korea from producing, reprocessing those spent fuel rods. They did put those 8,000 plus fuel rods into cooling ponds into 2003 when they removed them and started reprocessing them. So during that period of 1994 to 2003, yes, it was successful.
So basically it bought us, or it bought the world 9 years of time.
That's exactly right.
Right. Now, you were the U.S. representative to the Korean, it's always a hard one to say, Korean Peninsula Energy Development Organization, or KEDO, which, for our listeners at home, was a consortium of the United States, South Korea, Japan, and other states that was responsible for implementing the energy-related parts of the agreement by building light-water nuclear reactors for North Korea, which could not be used or abused to make nuclear weapons. Now, how long were you the rep for that project?
That was for over 2 years.
Okay.
Over 2 years in 2006. And that, as you accurately indicated, 2 light water reactors were being built at Kumho. The U.S. was providing heavy fuel oil in the interim until they were finally constructed and operational. So the U.S. was providing the heavy fuel oil in the interim, and South Korea and Japan, with the European Union, were paying for the cost of the actual construction.
Now, it's an oft-repeated truism in some circles that President Clinton only agreed to KEDO and the light water reactors because he and his advisors believed that North Korea would soon collapse, and so the deal wouldn't come to fruition anyway. Do you believe that's true?
I think there was a sense at that time. Remember, there was the transition of power between Kim Il-sung and then Kim Jong-il taking over in 1994. I think there was a sense that it was fragile, and there could have been a change in leadership. I don't know that they were convinced, if you will, the leadership was convinced that there would be a change. But I think there was a sense on the part of some that change was likely.
Now, also, of course, the Republican-controlled Congress at times refused to fund the KEDO project.
That's exactly right. That's what we had Japan and South Korea with the European Union assisting, coming to the fore and providing it. But mind you, we were providing the heavy fuel oil, which was equally costly, but that was our commitment.
How far along did construction of the 2 light water reactors actually get?
Oh, it started approximately in 1995, 96. It didn't stop until 2000, the latter part of 2002, when we had that issue with North Korea on the uranium enrichment program.
That was when Bob Kelly went, and
that was with Jim Kelly. The Assistant Secretary of State. Yes,
got my names mixed up.
He went. I believe it was October of 2002, and it was that at that time, and that was to be a good. That mission. It's always. I think the literature has it incorrectly. Jim Kelly went in October 2002 to reestablish a dialogue with North Korea. We had indications from visitors from South Korea to North Korea who met with Kim Jong-il that he wanted to re-engage with the U.S. So Jim Kelly's visit was to start the re-engagement process. But in the process of doing that, Jim Kelly was given some rather definitive information that North Korea was acquiring, if you will, aluminum tubes and Foblin oil, all indicating that they were pursuing a uranium enrichment program. So he brought that up during that meeting, and that was literally the beginning of the end of the relationship.
Yeah, but given that the light water reactors actually never were completed, can we say that was KEDO a failure?
No, I wouldn't say KEDO was a failure. I mean, one was approaching, I think, over half completion. But mind you, they were building two other reactors on their own. So it was not only the light water reactors that the U.S. was building. North Korea was also building two other reactors adjacent to the Yongbyon facility on their own.
Was that allowed under the framework?
Well, yes, they could do. They were just building it. They halted building it. With the framework, they would halt it. So you see, if we didn't have the agreed framework in 1994, what we could have seen is North Korea reprocessing those 8,000 plus spent fuel rods and then continuing with the construction of two separate, if you will, nuclear reactors, which were much bigger than the 5 megawatt reactor at Yongbyon.
Is it theoretically possible at some stage in the near future to go back and complete those KEDO light water reactors? Could somebody do that?
Well, that's a very good question. Well, we don't know. I think the assumption we have is that they've maintained those two light water reactors. One, again, was half completed.
Yeah.
The other was moving forward. There were some hiccups with the financing, and that's what slowed it up.
Right.
And that did anger North Korea. But yes, I think one could assume that North Korea maintained those two light water reactors and that they are pursuing it.
Now, let's get on to the six-party talks, which, of course, was North Korea, South Korea, Japan, Russia, China, and the United States. The six-party talks took place between 2003 and 2007 in 6 separate rounds with a number of phases each, during which phases, if I understand correctly, you were involved from the get-go, right? You were in 2003 made the special representative. And did you continue until 2007, all the way through?
I left in 2006, but then I went to the ODNI as an associate director, but also responsible for North Korea. So I worked very closely with Christopher Hill, Ambassador Christopher Hill.
So was he, in a way, your successor in that position?
Well, Christopher Hill took over from Jim Kelly as the assistant secretary.
Okay.
So he succeeded Jim Kelly. He oversaw everything. Mm-hmm. And Christopher Hill was very much involved with the joint statement of September 2005.
Right. He was also, he was there at the meetings too, wasn't he?
Meetings, absolutely. He was very much involved in that.
Right. So you're working sort of in tandem.
In tandem.
How did you divide roles?
Well, when I left in 2006, my role was to work with the intelligence community, 16 agencies, to ensure we were collecting as much insight as possible to provide to Christopher Hill and his team so they can go forward with the implementation. Because at that stage in 2006, if you remember, we had an agreement in 2005. There was a bit of a hiccup because North Korea slowed up the process because of Banco Delta Asia. So there was a year hiatus there where nothing happened. But then in 2006, when they got the $25 million unfrozen,
yes.
North Korea then started to implement if you will, the joint statement in earnest. And we were seeing movement there. So from 2006, with Christopher Hill, we worked very closely, providing him as much insight as possible, so that he and his team, but also the DOE, Department of Energy, monitors and others could be comfortable in their monitoring responsibilities.
Now, what was the actual experience of negotiating with North Korea like?
It ebbed and flowed. Yeah. You had good days and you had bad days. Look, these are professionals. I mean, I have high regard for the North Korean negotiators, mostly from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Kim Gae-gwan, Lee Gun, Madam Che Young-hee. These are all very, very professional. They're very hard negotiators. They read their talking points. The talking points are coming from Pyongyang.
Yeah.
My personal view is I don't think they have much discretion as negotiators. They have to go back to Pyongyang to get their talking points.
That's what I was going to ask. So they don't really have a lot of decision-making power by themselves.
My sense was they relied heavily, but nonetheless, they were, I think, positive in a lot of ways. They engaged. I have a high regard for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs interlocutors we had.
Now, in February 2007. This is the fifth round of the six-party talks, the third phase. There was a deal made that North Korea would shut down and seal Yongbyon nuclear facility, including the reprocessing facility, and it would invite back the IAEA personnel to conduct all necessary monitoring and verifications. Just even saying that, I feel a little bit of deja vu, because that wasn't the first time that had been promised. But anyway, according to a July 17, 2007 article in The Guardian by Mark Leon Goldberg, shortly after this deal was announced, you, as the chief American intelligence officer for North Korea, told Congress that there was never conclusive evidence of a secret uranium enrichment facility in North Korea. Is that still the case? Is there no conclusive evidence of that?
Well, I think the terminology I used at that time was that the intelligence community had moderate confidence. So it wasn't with high confidence, it was moderate confidence, which indicated that they had a program, but that what we literally didn't have what we were saying was we didn't feel we had the smoking gun per se.
Right.
There was still that sense that they had a clandestine uranium enrichment program. Mind you, when you come up with an assessment like that and you say moderate confidence, there are 16 agencies that vote on this that have to all concur. If you have one agency that's saying, I don't go along with high confidence, we would then take it down to the moderate confidence level, which is the medium level. And that's where we were there. I think we were pretty conclusive, though, that I think anyone who has worked the North Korean issue was convinced that North Korea did have that uranium enrichment program, which eventually they admitted to having.
Now, in where are we? February 2019, what facilities do you expect North Korea has in terms of existing nuclear weapons, nuclear weapon production facilities, and payload-capable ICBMs?
You know, I think it's immense. What's happened between 2007 and 2017, 10 years, I think the strides that North Korea has made, and certainly with Kim Jong-un taking over in 2011, it's immense. So we're talking about, it could be from 20 to 60 nuclear weapons. We certainly know the plutonium facility, the 5-megawatt reactor at Yongbyon. The sense is that there are other facilities. In addition to the uranium enrichment facility that they have at Yongbyon, which they showed in 2010, they have other outside the Yongbyon area, non-declared uranium enrichment facilities, and they could possibly even have undeclared plutonium facilities. So I think on the question of fissile material, immense. I think certainly on the question of delivery systems, missiles.
Yeah.
There's no question. In 2007, we saw them launch Hwasong-14, basically an ICBM. I mean, the trajectory was such that you could extrapolate from the actual launch itself that it was capable of reaching most of the continental United States.
Right, but it's the re-entry vehicle that's the...
There's no question about that. The sense is that unless you test it, it could burn up when it re-enters the atmosphere. So that becomes problematic. Can they actually launch an ICBM with a nuclear warhead that will successfully be re-entered the U.S. atmosphere?
Yeah. Well, what probability rating do you give it at this stage?
Well, you know,
based on what we've seen?
You know, I just don't think that sort of calculus is that important, because I think by definition, if they have a delivery system that can reach the United States, and they showed they had with the Hwasong-14, and they had a thermonuclear event, and they showed, so rather significant. And the assessment is that they've actually weaponized, and they can miniaturize it and made it to a delivery system. I don't think anyone is going to be betting on, well, it is problematic whether it could re-enter our atmosphere and not burn up. But does anyone want to take that chance? I don't think so.
Right. So in your view, it's not that important whether the re-entry vehicles are perfectly...
I think all the pieces on the table are important, and it indicates that there is a potential existential threat to the United States and its allies.
By the way, I think I read a couple of years ago that China's first re-entry vehicle was entirely made or covered in wood, in the sense that it could burn up, but there'd be enough of it that even after it would burn, there'd be, the warhead would still re-enter.
Still re-enter. I was not aware
And it was
of
kind of like a low-tech way of making it, but still effective, which is interesting, isn't it?
Yes. And that was what, 1964?
Yeah, we're talking way back.
Way back.
Now, the Leap Day Agreement, almost exactly 7 years ago, on the 29th of February 2012, the U.S. and North Korea announced a Leap Day Agreement under which the U.S. would provide substantial food aid to North Korea in return, once again, for a moratorium on uranium enrichment and missile testing, and a return of IAEA inspectors to Yongbyon, leading to a resumption of the six-party talks. Once again, deja vu. What went wrong with that Leap Day Agreement?
Well, it was April of that year, 2012. The 100th anniversary of the birth of Kim Il-sung, when his grandson, Kim Jong-un, said, I'm going to put a satellite in orbit, in celebration of this 100th anniversary. And the U.S. position was very clear that we had an agreement. Yeah. There would be a moratorium on missile launches. And they did have that event on I believe it was on April.
But, I mean, North Korea obviously makes a distinction between a missile and a rocket that launches a satellite. Is that a meaningful distinction?
I don't think it's a meaningful distinction. If you're looking at the same technologies that are necessary for a ballistic missile that can carry a nuclear warhead, you would use the same technology technologies for a rocket that's putting a satellite in orbit.
Now, that satellite launch aside, was the deal itself, the Leap Day deal, was it a good deal?
I thought it was a good deal. It was re-engaging. Mind you, we were re-engaging with a new leader.
Yeah,
and I think
right. He was very new.
It's very new.
3 months in.
3 months in, and here's a young man who studied in Switzerland.
Yeah.
He's coming in. He's replacing his father. This was an opportunity to re-engage and to get some momentum. We had momentum with his father, Kim Jong-il.
Right.
Otherwise, we wouldn't have the joint statement of 2005. And then we did have some progress on Yongbyon, taking down the cooling tower. And so we had monitors in Yongbyon. And so we did have some progress. And now with his son coming in, there was a good sense that he wanted to re-engage and move to get the food aid that's coming in. But more importantly, to reestablish a dialogue. And I think there's an element of guarded optimism. And of course, that didn't work because of the launch.
Do you think that North Korea going in knew that, look, we're going to launch this thing, it's probably going to scupper the deal, but let's go anyway?
You know, my view is, and I've been working with North Korea since 2003, as we discussed, North Korea has always maintained to me very clearly that no one could take the sovereign right of North Korea to put a satellite in orbit. There's no agreement they would sign that would say they could not put a satellite in orbit. So I have to admit, I was a bit surprised that they would have made that commitment not to have a total moratorium to include a satellite launch to put a missile in orbit. I think the North Koreans, at least to me, have always been clear that they have a sovereign right, regardless of any agreement, a sovereign right to put satellites in orbit.
Now, this may seem tangential, but it reminds me of the quote that in North Korea, the first human right is national sovereignty, right? That's the most important one.
Well, I mean, I think if you're sitting in Pyongyang, I think that is the issue, isn't it? Sovereignty.
Right.
And we're faced with that issue now when we talk about security assurances and other issues.
Now, what can we learn from the failure of the six-party talks and the Leap Day agreement that can be applied to these current talks between the Trump administration and Kim Jong-un?
I think the important point here is to keep the dialogue going. That's point number one. I think we've spent years, you mentioned the agreed framework, and it had some positive results. Unfortunately, it was not successful in the end. The joint statement of 2005, some positive results, was not successful at the end. After each of those two agreements that required significant effort to come up with, to establish, and certainly the joint statement took us 2.5 years to come up with that joint statement. Walking away was rather quick. I mean, you could do that in one day. You could do that in one meeting. And then to reestablish a dialogue, a meaningful dialogue, what happens is you lose that element of not only continuity, you lose the element of trust. So one of the lessons I take away from a lot of that is keep a dialogue going, regardless of the impediments. But you've always have to be ready to walk away from the table. If it's established, if you're convinced that there's no way you're going to get an agreement on denuclearization, obviously, and if you feel you're being duped, if you feel you're being played, well, then obviously you should have that option of walking away. I mean, that would be tragic if you didn't feel you could do that. So I think one of is stay the course, walk away when necessary if you have to walk away. Another is trust but verify. Verification is key to all of this. I'm sorry.
This is sending in inspectors?
Absolutely. I mean, you could have trust in your interlocutors, but many of the interlocutors you have aren't aware of all the particulars in their country. I think we were convinced, I certainly was convinced, that many of the interlocutors I was dealing with didn't know about the uranium enrichment program. I would put on the table, but you have this clandestine uranium enrichment program, you need to declare it. And they would say, Mr. DeTrani, we don't have that program.
As late as when?
When I was a negotiator, as late as 2006.
Really? This is 4 years after?
Even after the joint statement, because the joint statement, you will notice we didn't put uranium enrichment in the joint statement. In the joint statement, we said all operational nuclear program. We wanted to put all operational to include uranium enrichment program, and they said no. They refused. And we went along with China, and in this case, North Korea, because we wanted to move forward. So yes, I think the verification piece, and of course, the joint statement of 2005 failed on the issue of verification when they would not sign an agreement to permit nuclear monitors to leave Yongbyon and visit non-declared suspect nuclear sites.
Now let's talk about track 1.5 diplomacy. In January 2015, you, former U.S. Special Representative for DPRK Policy Stephen Bosworth, and Tony Namgung, former Deputy Director at Berkeley's Institute for East Asian Studies, met with Ri Yong-ho, who was then North Korea's top nuclear negotiator. Now, of course, he's foreign minister. We see him a lot in the media. Interestingly, this meeting was in Singapore, where the first Trump-Kim summit took place 3.5 years later. And speaking at a press conference in Singapore after the talks, Ri Yong-ho said that joint U.S. ROK military drills remained a sticking point for diplomatic progress. And he said these drills have constantly been mentioned as a problem that sticks in the craw of North Korea, and that their suspension would be the first step towards easing tension on the peninsula. So the question is, given that large-scale military drills in South Korea have been either suspended or heavily scaled down since last year, did North Korea ultimately get what it wanted all these years?
I think in that regard, yes. I think they did. I mean, they felt those, and as you correctly stated, Lee Yong-ho made it very clear that those joint military exercises were intimidating, threatening North Korea, their sovereignty. And they wanted them halted, yes.
Now, they also, generally in these Track 2 and Track 1.5 talks, mention the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula,
yes.
not denuclearization of our side of the Korean Peninsula.
That's correct.
How do you interpret what they mean by that?
Well, how I interpret it and how we told them we interpret it is that, and we've said very clearly, South Korea does not have any nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
And in 1991, I think President H.W. Bush made it very clear we were removing all tactical nuclear weapons that were in the South. So we said it absolutely. We went along with that terminology because it's legitimate terminology. It's just not looking at North Korea. I mean, and then the North Koreans would make it very clear in our negotiations. That means we could have monitors going to the South to verify that there are no nuclear weapons in the South if we believe there are suspect facilities. And the South Koreans were part of the six-party process, and they said, absolutely, we don't have nuclear weapons. So yes, we interpret it to be nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula. It has nothing to do with the presence of U.S. troops on the Korean Peninsula or if you will, the U.S. extended nuclear deterrence commitments to South Korea. It's basically nuclear weapons on the peninsula.
Right, but North Korea sometimes likes to take an extended view of this and talk about any nuclear weapons that might be, for example, in Japan or Guam, or that could be flown to the Korean Peninsula from elsewhere, and that they're really looking at removal of the nuclear umbrella over Korea.
They never said that. In all my years of working with North Korea.
Even in unofficial talks?
Even in unofficial talks.
Well, that's interesting. Because I had Evans Revere on the podcast last.
Well, I mean, maybe they mentioned to Evans, but they never mentioned it to me.
Ah, okay. Now, what about removal of U.S. troops from the Korean Peninsula?
Never mentioned that.
Well, do you think that they're really serious about that? Like, is that a real...
I think eventually they would love to see the U.S. troops leave, but they know it's not a sine qua non. They're not going to mandate that. They realize, and we've told them always, in anticipation of their query, that this is between the U.S. and the ROK. So it has nothing to do with our negotiations on the nuclear issues with North Korea and a normal relationship with the United States. That our troops in South Korea, it's between South Korea and the United States.
And th're generally happy to leave it at that in the talks with you?
Well, I think they hear it and they have to accept that that's our position, or that was our position. I hope it continues to be our position. I believe it still is.
Okay, now jumping forward to October 2016, you again with Robert Gallucci met in Kuala Lumpur. With Han Song-yeol, then North Korea's vice foreign minister. But apparently last year he was sacked and may be in a re-education camp now. He's kind of gone off the radar. You also met with Jang Il-hon, who was the deputy ambassador for the DPRK permanent mission to the United Nations. At this unofficial meeting, which explicitly did not involve the U.S. government, because it's 1.5, did you discuss with North Korea what might happen if Donald Trump were to become elected president of the U.S.?
That's a very good question. Because what we saw in our track 1.5, you mentioned the meeting with Lee Yong-ho in 2015, and even with Han Sung-yeol in 2017, there was a concern with the Obama administration with strategic patience that North Korea decided they were not going to deal with the Obama administration.
They're just going to wait it out.
They're going to wait it out. So there was an element of anticipation for President Trump to come in. And I think it wasn't expressed per se, but I think they alluded to the fact that there may be opportunities. Look, they said it very clearly in 2017, but in every meeting, certainly the official meetings, accept us as a nuclear weapons state and we will be a good friend of the United States. You've done it with Pakistan. This goes back to 2003 to yours truly. I've heard it so many times, and the answer has always been, look, the U.S. is not going to accept North Korea as a nuclear weapon state. Accepting North Korea as a nuclear weapon state, we're not saying you're going to use it against us or our allies or our partners. What we're saying is there will be a nuclear arms race in the region. Other countries, certainly South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, they'll seek nuclear weapons, and also the possibility of proliferation. And certainly, given what North Korea was doing with Syria and Al-Qabar, that the Israelis took out in 2007, I think the proliferation issue with nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons facilities is a valid point. So even in 2017 with Han Sung-rol and the Track 1.5, our response to his point was, accept us as a nuclear weapons state. We can come back to the table. We can resolve so many issues here. We could be a good friend of the United States. And we again, push back.
Is this something that you think they're still hoping, it's kind of angling for?
There's no question. In my mind, there's no question. North Korea wants, in the best of all situations, wants to retain some nuclear weapons capability, either nuclear weapons and a capability, ideally, or a capability to manufacture nuclear weapons. I think what they've seen with the Trump administration, with maximum pressure, with certainly the sanctions in 2017, and with the military exercises to include the introduction of strategic, if you will, assets, they've seen a determination on the part of the U.S. and its partners, to include certainly even China, because China's been implementing it, a strong sense that they, because of the escalation from North Korea, the United States and other countries, pursuant to the UN Security Council resolutions sanctioning North Korea, will implement them with vigor, and it will affect North Korea's well-being, economic well-being. I think they saw that determination, but I think also, I give a lot of credit to Kim Jong-un. Again, his New Year's address in January 2018, where he said, Byung-jin, I'm going to focus now on economic development. I think that helped him make that decision, focusing on it. But in the best of all worlds, if he can have both, if he can have the economic development and normal relations, academic to international financial institutions, while keeping nuclear weapons and or facilities, I think that's what they would want.
There's de facto acceptance of a nuclear state, and there's de jure recognition of a nuclear state. Now, if I'm not wrong here, the U.S. position on India and Pakistan is that they're not nuclear states, but we kind of know that they're nuclear states, right? It's de facto acceptance. Is there not a kind of a blink, sort of close your eyes to North Korea having some nuclear weapons?
I just don't think that's going to happen.
Right.
I just don't think that's going to happen. Certainly India and Pakistan and Israel, I might indicate, I think they're different countries, different times, different circumstances. But I think right now that's with North Korea, it's not going to. They do cite Pakistan, so your point's a valid point. They cite that as an example.
And Pakistan was, not as a state, but A.Q. Khan was a proliferator. I mean, he sold technology to North Korea, right?
Yes, he was the serial proliferator. Yeah. Exactly right. And they cite Pakistan. If that's the precedent, why is it different with us?
Right.
And we say, look, it is different.
Okay. For our website, nknews.org, John Power wrote an article in October 2015 about Track 2 diplomacy titled "Millions Spent, but What Has Track 2 with North Korea Achieved?" Now, in this article, you're quoted as saying that the talks largely revolved around conditions that the U.S. had put in place for the resumption of denuclearization talks. Trump kind of threw that playbook away by starting talks with almost no preconditions, didn't he? Is this something that we should have tried decades ago?
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. What we've not done with North Korea very well is bring in a great deal of creativity to the issues. And it's not a criticism of how we dealt with it. There is a playbook here, and that's working with the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, looking with that regime, talking about what declarations look like, what inspections look like. So there is a paradigm for working these issues. I think what President Donald Trump said, he said, I understand all that. Thank you very much. But if these people want to meet with me, if Kim Jong-un wants to meet with me, I'm going to meet with him. And if we can get a deal, I'll be the lead negotiator. I think most professionals would say that's not the way to do it.
Right, that top-down approach.
The top-down approach, and he did it. And we're seeing some success right now. I mean, guarded optimism that we have a second summit in a few weeks, And there could be momentum here that will lend itself to denuclearization.
Now, in that article with John Power, when asked about criticism that citizen engagement has produced few successes, you said they're probably right. What's been achieved? North Korea has more nuclear weapons. It has more delivery systems. Looking back now, what is the purpose and value of Track 1.5 and Track 2 negotiations with North Korea?
Well, that's very good. I wasn't sure about what I said then, but I'm glad you reminded me. Look, the value is contact. The value is a dialogue. The value is building trust and communicating. I just, to be very honest, I just can't understand those who say, they're bad, so I'm never going to talk to them. Okay, fine. If they're not willing to talk in a reasonable manner, if they're intimidating, if they're abusing, their so-called state rights, that's different. But I think a Track 1.5 or Track 2 where the North Koreans are willing to come out and have a dialogue, and they're willing to listen to our critique when we talk about their abuse on issues like human rights, illicit activities, proliferation. Those are things they hear and they take back to Pyongyang. And I'm sure it gets to Kim Jong-un, it got to Kim Jong-il. So it's not only us hearing what they're coming to when they come to these, if you will, unofficial 1.5 Track 2s or Track 2 meetings, they're hearing from us. And they're taking it back, and they need to hear it, if you will, from those people who are somewhat intimate in those issues here, because it may resonate, and hopefully it will resonate. So I think, one, it builds trust, but secondly, I think it's also an opportunity to communicate in a meaningful or more meaningful fashion than them gleaning it from the media. So
it's always important to keep communications going.
I think it's extremely important, especially during stressful periods when it's tense. And, 2017, this was a very tense period.
Well, I'm coming to that, in fact, right now. In 2017, that was an incredibly stressful year. Under President Trump's then Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, made a statement calling on states to downgrade or sever diplomatic relations with North Korea. And this, of course, we had increasing nuclear tests, missile tests by North Korea. And at that time, you said to our website, NK News, that, quote, the international community is at a tipping point with North Korea. Further nuclear and missile escalation from North Korea could result in conflict with significant casualties. This has to be avoided. It's therefore important for all countries to get the message to Pyongyang that further escalation will not be tolerated. One way to do this is to downgrade or sever diplomatic relations. That's a powerful message. How do you balance that with not stopping talking?
No, it's a very good point. Now, mind you, the talking we were talking about were unofficial communications, so not official. But the second point I would make here is 2017 was not a normal year. I mean, that was a year way beyond the pale. It was not only the nuclear tests, to include a thermonuclear, and the ICBM and the IRBM and the submarines. It was also the U-tubes, taking out Washington, D.C., taking out Seoul with the nuclear weapon. So, and it basically was Kim Jong-un at that time. I think it was very threatening to the region, South Korea, Japan, certainly even the United States, in the sense that he was building capability, showing the capability, and being seemingly reckless in going down a path. So, intellectually, if he did launch something, and it looked like it could be an IRBM or ICBM or even a medium range, and no one knew what was on the tip of that. I think Article 5 of the UN Charter gives every country the right to defend themselves. I think what we would do is preempt that launch, and that could be the beginning of a lot of miscalculations. Yeah. So stumbling into conflict in 2017, I think, was extremely real.
But doesn't then cutting off diplomatic relations increase that risk of a miscalculation?
Well, we were hoping, and I think we did see some success, or a lot of success, because of the sanctions and the implementation of sanctions. If other countries would further isolate North Korea, if other countries would implement the sanctions in a very meaningful way, North Korea will realize not only are they further isolated, but they're not getting the economic, if you will, revenue necessary to sustain, if you will, the elites in Pyongyang and what have you. It was further pressure on North Korea. I mean, look. That was one of the few tools we had, short of using something that could be even approaching something of a kinetic nature.
Like a bloody nose strike.
Yes, yes. So we're using anything short of a bloody nose strike, a kinetic move, to indicate to North Korea, this is, you have the world sort of responding to your behavior in a cohesive way, saying, we will not tolerate it. And I think that was the point of doing it, because again, it was beyond the pale. It wasn't a normal period.
Right.
A normal period, I could see dialogue, but what they were doing with the launches and with the missile tests and the YouTubes.
Right, the videos, I'd forgotten about those videos.
And you would say, why are you doing that? I mean, are you looking for conflict?
Now, then the obvious follow-on question is, what is it that made Kim Jong-un in 2018 say, okay, I'm ready for talks, I'm coming back to the table? Was he brought back by fear, or was he simply just ready? He said, okay, we've got the nukes, we've got the ICBMs, I'm ready to go back and talk now.
I think it's both. He said it very clearly, and you just said it right now. He said, well, you now have a nuclear deterrent. Security is key for North Korea, and we have to appreciate that. Security is key. And the best security is having, from North Korea's perspective, obviously conventional weapons and the work they did on other things, whether it's chemical, biological, and everything, but nuclear weapons were a very overt deterrent. And he said, now I've shown the world we have a nuclear deterrent. So I don't have to prove myself any longer. We have been doing this for decades, billions of dollars. And now I just want to focus on what we really need, and that's economic development.
Former North Korean diplomat to the United Kingdom, Tae Yong-ho, who now lives here in South Korea, in his book, it's a thick book, he says basically that all North Korean negotiations about nuclear weapons have been attempts to buy time. And I'm just listening to you now, it almost seems like, okay, so the last few decades, but certainly since the agreed framework forward, North Korea's been buying time to get the nuclear deterrent, and once it was ready, then it's ready to talk seriously. And it almost seems like it doesn't make any difference which president was in power or who was doing what. No one was going to talk until North Korea was ready to talk.
That's a fair point, but I will say this. North Korea, with the agreed framework, if we did not detect the uranium enrichment program, if we did not confront them with that program...
In 2002.
North Korea would have moved forward to normalize a relationship with the United States. And they would have normalized it, and because they were moving and we were building light water reactors, they would have taken those spent fuel rods out and not reprocessed them, but destroyed them. But unbeknownst to us at that time, they would have still had a uranium enrichment, highly enriched enrichment capability to fabricate nuclear weapons. So we would have normalized a relationship with a country that indeed either was or was on the cusp of becoming a nuclear weapon state. So I think they were serious during that period. I think they thought they can get away with it, to be very honest with you.
Right.
But when they realized they couldn't get away with it, maybe what you just said is logical. We'll just sort of punt the ball and see if we can go along and then build capability. But I personally think North Korea was, hoping two things. One, they can convince the U.S. that we should treat them the way we treated Pakistan. Accept them, maybe cap their program.
Right.
They come back to the NPT as a nuclear weapon state. We've never said you could do that. Even in our joint statement, we said come back to the NPT as a non-nuclear weapon state. So ideally, that's what they want, number one. If they couldn't get that, then we'll have a clandestine uranium enrichment program, and we can get all of the benefits. We can normalize with it, and then we still have that. They couldn't get that. So the two things they wanted, they couldn't get. So you have a new leader who races for, if you will, the gold ring.
Right.
And that's missile delivery systems that could touch the United States, and nuclear capabilities of a thermonuclear nature, and with the weaponization and with the miniaturization and so forth. So I don't think they were punting all along. I think they were serious in accomplishing their goals, but they were frustrated in the process of doing that. Kim Jong-un came in and was able to speed the process up and was successful. We saw it in 2017. But he also realized at great expense, because they were very close up. They were on the cusp of conflict. There's no question about that. You're
talking about the possible or the potential of a bloody nose strike in April.
Absolutely, of escalating and miscalculations that we could have stumbled into conflict on the Korean Peninsula very easily, in my view, in 2017. So he was gambling during that period, but he got it. And then once he got it, he said, "That's it." And that's a strategic decision he made. He said, "I have a nuclear deterrent. I'm never going to use it," and all that. Although he said, "I'll build more capabilities," we got to remember what he said. I also want to just focus now on economic development. And that was the beginning of the element of rapprochement.
Now, just as you said, 2017 was not a normal year. 2018, quite an abnormal year, a lot going on there. Everything took a 180. Now, Tim Shorrock wrote an article for The Nation on March 22 last year. This is just before the first summit between President Moon and Chairman Kim, but after the success of the Pyeongchang Olympics. And in his article, you describe President Moon Jae-in as having, quote, not only taken the lead, he's taken the lead and run with it in a very impressive way. He's handled this brilliantly. Almost a year later, do you still believe President Moon is handling this brilliantly?
Yes, I do. He's opened up that dialogue with North Korea. He's opened it up in the sense that, the trust factor is I think has been created, to be honest with you, and he has showed Kim Jong-un that there's value in if you will, a normal relations with the South, and eventually with a federation, ultimately reunification. So I think he's done that well, but he's brought the U.S. in a very skillful way, and he's focused on the core issue, which is denuclearization. So I think Moon Jae-in has been able to affect that dialogue, that relationship with Kim Jong-un. And bring the U.S. in the person of President Donald Trump into the equation, and then show his commitment to denuclearization, to the alliance with the United States, but also the need for rapprochement with the North and what that will bring to the table. So I think managing North Korea and the United States, if you can manage both well and still have progress, I think that's pretty skillful. And I give him credit for that.
Do you believe that the Singapore summit last year between Trump and Kim was a success?
Yes, I do.
Well, then, after all this time and all these false starts and rotations of the cycle of, crisis, negotiations, deal-making, and back to crisis, are you more inclined to be hopeful or skeptical?
I'm hopeful. There's no doubt in my mind I'm hopeful.
What are you expecting from the upcoming summit on February 27th and 28th between President Trump and Chairman Kim in Vietnam?
I think it will be successful. I think the summit will indicate clearly, they'll hear again what we mean by complete denuclearization.
Right. Will we get details?
Oh, well, I think we will look for details.
The roadmap.
I think, we won't get a roadmap, but I think we'll get details. And they'll hear, look, they don't want the term complete, verifiable, irreversible dismantlement. They see CVID as offensive. They've always said that. But this is what we're talking about. They will hear that again, and we're going to say, now, we do need to hear clearly from you. Use the language you want to use, but it's complete, verifiable denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. And are you on that? And how do you define that? And that gets to your point initially, Taco, when you talked about, does that include the U.S. military? We're not going to propose that, but certainly they have an opportunity saying, well, your military presence in the South is threatening to us. They could do that. I mean, there's an opportunity to elucidate and to talk about that. So I think this will be a candid discussion. I think we'll put the core issues will be put on the table. I personally think it will be successful because there'll be greater clarity, certainly from the U.S. side, but also from the North Korean side. And I think there will be a commitment for our lead negotiators, Steve Biegun, working now with Kim Yong-chol, to really get together and build that roadmap with timelines for the denuclearization. But concurrent with that, also with security assurances, economic development assistance, the potential for lifting of certain sanctions.
Right, because there's got to be some incentives, right?
Yes, there's got to be incentives. And talking about eventually a peace treaty to end the Korean War. So all those issues will be put on the table. The two lead negotiators, Steve and Mr. Kim Yong-chol, they will start meetings, and that's where the heavy lifting gets done. And I think there will hopefully some timelines will be there. I doubt very much they'll use timelines, but I think we will start moving in that direction. And that will be progress.
I recently had Chris Green on this podcast, who is the Korea representative for the International Crisis Group, and they, in their recent report, put forward this, what they called... I want to say it's a modest proposal, but they don't call it that. They call it something else. But I'm going to relabel it a modest proposal, which is kind of as a step one, North Korea shuts down Yongbyon for once and for all, and the United States allows for the reopening of the Kaesong industrial complex as a sort of a initial trust-building process. Is that possible?
Well, everything's possible. That's the whole point of negotiations, and that's the whole point of being creative in our negotiations.
No, but we've had, for example, John Bolton and other people in the United States government saying, no lifting of sanctions, no relief until everything is fully verifiably, irreversibly, denuclearized. But, this kind of step-by-step phased approach
Well, it could be a phased approach like that. It could be, we don't have to lift the sanctions per se to ensure that North Korea gets some of the benefits, the economic benefits from trade with China. You mentioned Kaesung, where there could be a footnote to the sanctions, the UN Security Council resolution sanctions, saying Kaesung would be not applicable in regards to exemption or carve out or something along those lines. So I think that's where the negotiators really can do some heavy lifting and come up with some creative ways of moving forward with the focus on the core issue of complete verifiable denuclearization, but also, and that's an element of actions for actions. And, in our joint statement of 2005, we not only said actions for actions, we said commitments for commitments, where we could put, North Korea says, okay, you want that on denuclearization? Now, what do you have on, if you will, security assurance? What do you have on economic development? What do you have on peace? That was one of the 4 bullets in the joint statement of June 2018 with President Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un, that there will be peace on the Korean Peninsula. How are we going to move on that? Is it going to be initially a declaration? All those things need to be put on the table there. I think this is an opportunity. It's a shame if we just go back to our standard positions and we're going to be rigid, and this is what we're going to, and North Korea is rigid, then we'll go nowhere. And we'll go back to where we were. There'll be escalation. We'll be sanctioning them. There'll be a lot of tension. And God knows we could possibly stumble into conflict. Or we could say, look, let's defuse it. Let's do it comprehensively. Look, in our heart of hearts, we know something. North Korea wants to retain nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons capabilities. It's their element of security. I think we can understand that. As a country, that's been invaded over 500 times over 2,000 years of recorded history, they can understand they're looking at, and we're saying that's not going to give you the best security. It's going to lend itself to, if you will, a nuclear arms race, proliferation issues, and you're going to be sanctioned, you're going to be isolated. That's not just the security you want. Kim Jong-un has to really trust us being the corporate us, South Korea, the United States, Japan, China, Russia. When we say these things here, because they spent decades building these weapons and billions of dollars, and they're just going to walk away from it. You can imagine the people in North Korea telling Kim Jong-un, don't do it.
Yeah, well, he's security apparatus for sure.
Don't do it. We got to retain something. And, I don't think he can be totally oblivious to these people. I mean, he is, an autocrat. He has removed a lot of senior people, to include his uncle,
and his half-brother?
His half-brother, Kim Jong-nam, in Kuala Lumpur International Airport. So, yes, but he's got to listen to some of these people. So I think we're at a good inflection point right now.
So given that, just between you and me, what do you think is the probability that we will see a fully denuclearized North Korea within a decade?
It's a good question. It's a difficult question. My first reaction would be, we can accomplish that. I think we could see a North Korea, a Korean peninsula that's totally denuclearized. I think we could see it. I think North Korea is going to work hard to ensure that they retain some nuclear weapons capability, and that's going to be the pressure on the United States and South Korea, but also Japan and China and Russia, because they're involved, as other countries are, to ensure it doesn't go that way. So if we stay the course, but that means staying the course means we all have to be united. When we talk about sanctions, we have to be all united that we would all implement those sanctions. Because if North Korea sees there are cracks, if North Korea believes that you can never really reimpose sanctions that would be so biting, I think they'll go that way. But if we're united and we're committed, and they know we're committed, I think we could eventually see it.
Now, I've got one more quick topic to bring in just at the end, which I think is relevant here. We've got to talk about the case of Banco Delta Asia. It's a small Macau-based bank where various North Korean entities in 2005 were found to have about $25 million in various accounts. In 2007, the U.S. Treasury Department ordered all U.S. banks and companies to sever ties with Banco Delta Asia, and that is still current, meaning that bank still, even to this day, is blacklisted and cannot deal with in U.S. dollars.
I didn't know that they were still prohibited from dealing with U.S. dollars.
I'd have to check. I could be wrong on that one.
It could be, because I thought it was resolved when the $25 million that Banco Delta Asia had frozen North Korean reserves. That money was returned to North Korea.
Right, but it was via a circuitous route.
It was via the Federal Reserve Bank in New York City.
Yeah. What are the ramifications of this case on the conduct of negotiations? Did it help or did it harm negotiations at that time?
Well, look, at that time, we had a joint statement. And literally on the same day we signed the joint statement, there was a Federal Registry notice indicating that Banco Delta Asia was being sanctioned by our Treasury Department The predicate being money laundering on the part of North Korea. So that slowed the process up for a number of months. But I think North Korea now understands diplomacy is diplomacy, but law enforcement is another track. You can't assume because you're negotiating that, on the other hand, we could be counterfeiting your currency. We could be selling, counterfeit pharmaceuticals and drugs and so forth, and get away with it because you're negotiating with diplomats. No, it's dual tracked. And we told them that very clearly. If you're in violation of our law, our law enforcement authorities will go after you, whether we're negotiating, which is what we did, and we're coming to some agreements. I don't think they understood that. I don't think they believed us. Mm-hmm. But I think they do understand that now.
You think now they get it? Okay.
I think they do get it now.
So in the current situation, it's still quite possible for the U.S. Treasury to keep doing its thing, and even during the negotiations between Donald Trump and Chairman Kim. So what would happen then if an agreement is reached in Vietnam on, for example, a phased closing of its nuclear facilities, and then Treasury jumps in to play whack-a-mole on the head of any financial institution holding North Korean money? Well,
if that money they're holding was acquired through illicit means, the predicate being, again, money laundering or anything along those lines, this Patriot Act, Section 211, I think law enforcement has an obligation to pursue those cases wherever they may go. And I've worked with our legal authorities. I did it certainly in 2005, 2006, and I was totally supportive of what they did. We literally didn't even know the timing when they would do it because it's a separate track. And that's our system. So yeah, it could happen again. Ideally, North Korea is not involved in money laundering and counterfeiting and other illicit activities that would necessitate action of that sort on the part of Treasury.
So you're saying that basically if the money is not from illicit means, then it should be okay?
Yes, exactly.
But the U.S. Treasury Department and the Federal Reserve has such immense power that banks, how should we say, they're a little bit gun-shy, and they will blanket refuse anything to do with North Korea. We even hear humanitarian organizations, for example, they're trying to bring in supplies into North Korea. They can't do it with banks because the banks say, "Oh, that's got North Korean hands all over it. We won't touch it."
Well, I mean, the truth is, I don't think we should avoid that. I think when we do have those, if you will, those mandates in play, if we do have those policies in play, I think they should be adhered to. I think people should comply accordingly with them. There was a purpose for doing that. It was a purpose for not interacting with North Korea on some of those things. And now it may have been painful. Certainly, when you talk about humanitarian aid, and they were cutouts. I mean, there were exceptions. Organizations, if you will, NGOs, humanitarian organizations, were able to do business, whether it's tuberculosis, whether it's other humanitarian issues, there, food, and what have you. Well, they had to get exemptions, if you will.
It's funny you should mention that, actually, because the Eugene Bell Foundation, for example, which does great work with tuberculosis in North Korea, last year when I met with their head,
Steve Linton, was it?
Yes,
Steve Linton?
He was telling us that they have these isolation wards, quarantine wards for tuberculosis patients, trying to bring them, but because there's pieces of metal in those isolation wards, they couldn't get them through, and try though they might, they couldn't get a written exemption.
No, that's exactly right. I think Steve Linton, what he does with Eugene Bell, with Sister Heidi Linton, they do such outstanding work, especially in tuberculosis care. And I think now there are exceptions where they are able to get materials, if you will, medicines and other things into North Korea. But again, that's sort of the unfortunate thing, because but there are exceptions, and it takes more work on the part of these humanitarian groups that are doing good work, humanitarian work, that will have to go through a bureaucratic, if you will, in their views, a bureaucratic process to get the exception and so forth. But I think now, things have loosened up accordingly. But again, we were going through a very tense period. Again, this is 2017, Jack. So I think we have to put that in context. This was not a normal period. It was an atypical period. It was a period we were coming very close to conflict with North Korea. So we were going to use every tool available to squeeze North Korea to say, these are the consequences for what you're doing. Do you understand the consequences? Do you understand the consequences could even be greater if we stumble into something beyond this? I think the Eugene Bell Foundation and Steve Linton and Heidi Clinton, all these people doing such great work,
Collateral damage?
Collateral damage, and that's unfortunate, but this was not a typical period. And I think we're going now into a typical period where we have meaningful negotiations, the prospects for resolution with some progress, and ultimately, hopefully, resolution. And I think all these other organizations will go back to normal operations with North Korea.
Okay, final question. If you're able to whisper a few words into the ears of either Stephen Biegun or President Trump right now before the upcoming summit, what would you advise? What would you tell them?
Well, two things. I would say certainly keep the talks going. And for Steve Biegun, Mr. President, ensure that North Korea is committed to having their lead representative meet with Steve Biegun to work on the particulars. Because it's not enough for you and Chairman Kim Jong-un to meet every 6 months and think everything is going to be, copacetic, everything's going to be fine based on that. It doesn't work that way. You could set the policy, but there has to be negotiators to do the heavy lifting. And you have to get Kim Jong-un to say, yes, he's committed to routine working groups between the lead negotiators to work on the particulars. That certainly is one. The other is I would not rush into any deal that does not have very clear, understandable verification protocols. I think that's going to be so important. It's not a question of infringing on North Korea's sovereign rights. It's a question of doing the due diligence necessary. And if they're in compliance, there should be no problem with that. Is to ensure that we have a very robust verification protocol that would confirm all the commitments Kim Jong-un and his negotiators are making.
Now, last question. I know I said last question once. I've got to say it twice now. Last question. We haven't mentioned human rights in all this. At what stage is it appropriate to inject human rights into this conversation that President Trump and Chairman Kim are having?
I think it's proper to bring it up right now.
Okay, because it wasn't mentioned in Singapore. So you're saying basically in Vietnam, let's talk about it. Let's put it on the table.
I mean, I think, look, in the context we've always told North Korea when we were doing the six-party talks and when we had the joint statement. Ultimately, North Korea wants a normal relationship with the United States. It gives them access to the U.S., but also international financial institutions. We said to get a normal relationship with the United States, to start the process of getting that relationship, it's denuclearization. But then you have to stop your illicit activities, counterfeiting our currency, and you have to be more transparent and show progress on human rights issues. So I think in that context, this is a separate issue from denuclearization per se, but it's not a separate issue when it comes to normalization of relations with the United States. And ultimately, that's what they want.
I understand. Well, thank you again, Ambassador DeTrani, for coming on the NK News podcast today. It's been a delight talking to you.
It was great. I enjoy it, and I appreciate the great work that you do. I mean, I'm an avid reader, and I know so many people follow you, so keep up the great work.
Thank you very much. Don't forget, listeners, you can listen to all of our shows as well as read full bios and show notes on our website, nknews.org. You'll also find a photograph of Ambassador DeTrani and myself there on the website, and you can send feedback, comments, questions, and guest suggestions to podcast@nknews.org. Our podcast was produced, as always, by Arias Dare and facilitated by Chad O'Carroll and Christina Lee. Lastly, a reminder that one random reviewer per week will win a free NK News membership, so please review us after listening and you might win. And you can save $50 off your subscription by using the code podcast at the checkout. Please do share this with your friends so that we can get more listeners. Thanks very much, and check us again next time.